There is a particular kind of humiliation that doesn't arrive with a shout. It arrives with laughter, with the clink of wine glasses, with a king spinning his mistress across a marble floor while 1,000 courtiers watch and say nothing, because silence is safer than standing beside the woman being erased. Tonight, Queen Selene Vane learned that the crown on her head was never protection. It was a leash, and the man holding it just dropped it in front of everyone to prove he could. Stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button right now and drop your city name in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Deaths. The Great Hall of Ardyn had been built to make men feel small. That was the honest truth behind the architecture, even if no one said it aloud anymore. The vaulted ceilings climbed 50 feet above the polished obsidian floors, hung with iron chandeliers so enormous they blocked the drafts from the northern windows in winter. The stone columns along the walls were carved with the faces of past kings, 23 of them, jaw set and cold-eyed, looking down at the living with the particular contempt of men who no longer had to answer for anything. The whole structure was built on the logic that smallness kept people obedient, that if you walked into the throne room and felt the ceiling press down on your chest, you'd remember your place. Tonight, nearly 1,000 candles burned inside those chandeliers. The winter banquet had drawn the full court. Dukes and their wives sat at long tables draped in pale linen. Merchant lords from the eastern ports moved through the crowd in coats that cost more than a village's annual grain supply. Foreign dignitaries occupied the seats of honor near the raised dais. 2 ambassadors from the Thyran Confederacy, who had ridden 3 weeks through ice roads to finalize a grain treaty that Ardyn desperately needed. Servants moved between tables with silver platters. Musicians in the upper gallery played something soft and forgettable. The great fire at the room's eastern wall threw amber light across a scene of curated prosperity. Selene Vane stood near the edge of the raised platform where the royal table sat. She had been standing for 2 hours, not because she lacked a chair. Her seat was there, 6 inches to Cedric's left, right where it had always been, but because sitting meant staring at the empty space beside him. Cedric had not arrived yet. That was the custom he had invented over the last 8 months, ever since Morelle had returned from her father's estate in the Western Hills and re-entered the court with the specific confidence of a woman who had been promised something. The queen's gown was deep blue, cut in the northern style she had grown up with before her marriage, structured across the shoulders, fitted through the body, hem brushing the floor in a single clean line. No excess. No ornamentation except the silver crown resting at the base of her dark hair. She wore it the way she wore everything, without thinking about it, because it was simply part of what she was. Her hands were still. That was the first thing people noticed about Selene Vane, and the last thing they understood about her. Her hands were always still. Even now, holding a wine cup she had not drunk from, fingers loose and relaxed at the stem, she gave nothing away to the room. Inside it was different. Inside, she had been running calculations since the afternoon. She had watched Morelle's chambermaid carry a trunk of clothing into the East Wing corridor that morning. The East Wing was adjacent to Cedric's private chambers. Selene had stood at the window of her own rooms, which occupied the West Wing, separated from the king's by the full breadth of the palace, and watched the trunk disappear around the corridor bend. Then she had turned back to the dispatches on her writing desk and continued reading. A grain shortage in the Delvath provinces, a tariff dispute along the river border, a letter from the Thyran ambassador requesting confirmation of the treaty terms before his government would commit the full sum. She had answered all 3 letters before midday. She had handled the ambassador personally, walking him through the agricultural projections herself, because Cedric's trade minister was a man who believed confidence could substitute for competence. And she had learned years ago that letting him lead those conversations cost her twice the work afterward. She had done what she always did. She had held things together by herself, quietly, so that the kingdom could believe the crown was functioning. The musicians shifted tempo. Someone near the hall's entrance blew a short horn. Informal, not a herald's call, just the signal the major domo used when the king was approaching. Selene did not turn toward the doors. She heard the room change before she saw anything. The conversations at the nearest tables dropped half a volume. Chairs scraped as people adjusted their postures. The particular social electricity that moved through a crowd when power entered a room rippled outward from the doors toward the dais, and Selene tracked it by the shifting of faces around her without moving her own. Cedric Vane walked into the great hall of Ardyn with Lady Morell on his arm. He was 38 years old, broad through the chest, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been called handsome for so long that handsome had become less a description than a title. He carried himself the way men did who had been told since birth that rooms were built for them. His coat was wine-dark velvet, open at the collar, the gold chain of his kingship sitting heavy across his collarbone. He was smiling. The smile was the real weapon, generous and easy, the kind that made you feel chosen for receiving it. Morell wore red. Selene had known she would wear red. Red was the choice of a woman announcing herself. Morell was 26, long-necked, with pale amber eyes that she used with the precision of a craftsman. She understood exactly what she was doing on Cedric's arm tonight. Not seduction, not anymore. That phase had ended months ago. This was something else. This was installation. Cedric led her straight to the royal table. He sat down in his chair at the table's center. He pulled Morell's chair out for her himself, the chair to his right, the chair of honored guest. Then he looked up at the room with the same easy smile, lifted his cup, and said nothing. The court received this information and processed it with the speed and skill of people who had survived by learning to look at disasters without reacting. Selene walked to her own chair. She sat down. She set her wine cup on the table in front of her. She picked up her fork. "My queen." Lauren Ashby, her personal secretary, materialized at her shoulder. He was 40, quiet, with narrow shoulders and the ability to make himself invisible that Selene had come to depend on absolutely. He kept his voice at a level the table couldn't hear. "The Thyran ambassadors are asking about placement. They were not informed of—" He stopped, chose a word carefully. "Of the seating arrangement. Put them at the east end of the primary table," Selene said. Her voice was level, dinner conversation level. "Tell them I will come to them before dessert, and make sure Holt is at their left shoulder. His Thyran is better than Varen's." "Yes, my queen." He withdrew. Cedric leaned across toward Morell and said something. She laughed. A low, private laugh, her hand touching his wrist for a moment before she let go. The touch was practiced. It was meant to be seen. Selene cut her meat and ate. The dinner lasted 3 hours. Selene spent those 3 hours doing the work of a functioning monarch at a table where her husband had installed his mistress 4 feet to her right. She held a 12-minute conversation with the Thyran ambassadors and came away with enough additional concessions in the grain treaty that Ardyn's storage crisis would be manageable through spring. She spoke with the Duke of Calvin's wife about the flooding situation in the eastern districts and extracted a commitment for emergency levee repairs that the Duke had been stalling on for 2 months. She listened to the merchant Lord Cassidan's careful, circuitous complaint about tariff irregularities along the southern ports, understood what he was actually asking for, and gave him half of it with enough grace that he left the conversation satisfied. She did this with the crown sitting level on her head and her hand still on the table between courses. Cedric, meanwhile, held Morell's hand. He did it openly, not hidden under the table. Right there on top of the white linen, her fingers laced through his, in full view of every duke and lord and foreign dignitary in the hall. He poured her wine himself. He cut something from his own plate and offered it to her fork. He laughed at things she said. He ignored, with flawless consistency, the wife sitting to his left. Selene knew what this was. She had known what it was for 8 months, maybe longer. It was a test of endurance. It was the bet that she would stay, that she would absorb the insult, fold it into herself, and continue functioning because she always had, because the kingdom needed her to. Because leaving meant abandoning the grain treaty and the levee repairs, and the 300,000 people in the Delvath province who would face spring without emergency stores if the wrong person held this seat. He was counting on her love of the work to substitute for any love he owed her. She understood this with the clarity of someone who had been paying attention. After the 3rd course, the floor was cleared for dancing. This was the part of formal banquets that Selene had always endured rather than enjoyed. The music got louder. The candles were refueled. The court rearranged itself into the specific social configurations of people watching and people being watched, and the king traditionally led the first dance with his queen. Cedric stood up from the table. He extended his hand, not to Selene. The room did not go silent. That would have been too obvious. But it did that thing it did. That muffled adjustment, that collective breath held half a second longer than usual, those small, arrested gestures of people suddenly very interested in their wine cups. Morel took his hand and stood. They walked to the center of the cleared floor together. Selene sat at the royal table and watched her husband dance with his mistress at the winter banquet of Ardyn in front of 1,000 people with the deliberateness of a man doing something he had decided to do. The music was formal. The dance was the Aldenmere, the traditional opening dance of royal ceremonies, the one whose steps had been the same for 200 years, the one that was performed exclusively by married couples at formal court events. Selene had danced it with Cedric at 7 consecutive banquets. She knew the exact count of every measure. Cedric danced it with Morel. Morel knew the steps. She had learned them. Of course she had. Lord Ashby appeared at Selene's shoulder again. She felt him there before he spoke. "My queen," he said. Just those 2 words, very quiet. "I see it," she said. "What would you like me to—" "Nothing." She picked up her wine cup. "Nothing, right now." Cedric spun Morel through the turn at the 4th measure. Morel's red dress flared out. He was still smiling. Several courtiers near the dance floor had begun applauding lightly, not out of approval, Selene thought, but out of the human instinct to fill terrible silence with sound. Duke Heron of the northern provinces materialized in the empty chair to her left. He was 61, white-haired, built like a retired soldier, with a face that had never been good at pretending. He had served her father's court before her marriage. He sat down without asking permission, which was the right call. "This is deliberate," he said. "Yes," Selene said. "He knows what he's doing." "He's always known what he's doing. That was never the problem." She set her cup down. "The problem is that he's decided the cost is acceptable." Heron was quiet for a moment. On the floor, Cedric and Morel completed the opening sequence. More applause. A few of the younger courtiers, reading the room and choosing sides with the speed of people whose livelihoods depended on choosing correctly, had moved toward the dance floor in a way that suggested approval. "The Thyran ambassadors are watching," Heron said. "I know. If they report this back to Thyra, the treaty is signed. I handled it before dinner." She glanced at him sideways. "The structural problems aren't tonight's treaty. The structural problems are everything that happens after tonight, when every foreign court that has ever done business with Ardyn gets the story of what happened at the winter banquet." Heron rubbed his jaw. "What are you going to do?" Selene looked at her husband dancing. She watched him for a long moment. The easy way he held Morel, the unearned comfort of a man who had never had to reckon with real consequences, the smile that had probably cost her years of her life spent believing it meant something. "Nothing tonight," she said. "I'm going to do nothing tonight." Heron turned to look at her. There was something in her voice, not anger, because anger was hot and this was cold, that made him look. Really look. "Selene," he said. She didn't answer. The dance ended. The court applauded with more conviction than it felt. Cedric led Morel back toward the royal table, and as he passed, his eyes found Selene's for the first time all evening. He met her gaze with that smile. That particular smile she had spent 11 years learning the taxonomy of, the one that wasn't warm, wasn't cruel, was simply indifferent in the specific way of men who had never needed to extend themselves toward another person's pain. Then he looked away. Selene watched him settle back into his chair. She watched Morel refill his cup from the decanter. She watched the court reassemble around this new configuration of power as though it had always been this way. And something in her chest, which had been holding tension like a fist for the better part of a decade, quietly, without drama, opened its fingers and let go. Not of grief. Grief was still there, sitting at the base of her sternum where it had lived for 2 years, dense and familiar. She had made her peace with grief. Grief was honest. What let go was something else. The premise she had been operating from. That endurance was the same as strength, that staying was the same as surviving, that the work she did for the kingdom was the same as having a life she had chosen. That premise had been running in her like a river so long she had stopped hearing it. It had just been the sound of things. Sitting at the royal table of Ardyn, watching her husband hold another woman's hand in full view of the court and the foreign dignitaries and the 23 stone kings looking down from the walls, Selene heard the sound of that river stop. She sat very still. She finished her wine. 2 hours later, the banquet concluded. The palace at night had a different architecture than the palace by day. Selene had learned this in the first months of her marriage, had mapped the night palace the way she mapped everything, methodically, because information was the only currency she had ever fully trusted. She knew which corridors the night guard patrolled and at what intervals. She knew where the drafts came from and how to move through them without the candle in your hand giving you away. She knew the servants' stairs at the east end of the south hall, the ones that bypassed the main corridor and led out near the stables. She had never expected to use that knowledge for this. She moved through her chambers without lighting the primary lamps. The fire in the grate gave enough. She went to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, not the one with the state jewelry, the one behind it, the one that held the clothing she had brought with her from her father's estate in the Northern Territories 11 years ago. Wool, fur-lined leather, a traveling coat in dark gray that was cut for riding, not ceremony. She dressed efficiently. She had always been efficient. Her hands were still. She stood at the mirror, not the tall, ornate one near the door, the small, plain one she kept on the writing desk that her mother had given her, and looked at herself for a moment. The traveling coat? Hair down. No crown. She had set the crown on the bedside table when she came in. She looked at it now. The silver had gone warm from her head, and it sat there catching the firelight, looking like what it was, a piece of metal with a specific symbolic function. She thought about what that function had cost her. She picked up her riding gloves. She did not pick up the crown. She left it where it was. The servants' stairs were cold and smelled of stone. She moved quietly, not because she was hiding from anyone in particular, but because quiet was right for what this was. There was a language to actions. The way you did something communicated what kind of thing you were doing. She was not sneaking. She was not fleeing. She was making a decision, and the decision deserved to be made cleanly. The stables were dark except for the lantern the night groom kept burning at the far end. She knew the horse she wanted, Ardyn, the gray she had ridden since he was 3 years old, a northern-bred stallion her father had given her as a wedding gift, with the note that she should always have something that was hers. She had spent more time with this horse in the last 2 years than she had spent willingly in the same room as her husband. The groom heard her coming. He appeared from the tack room, young, 16 maybe, with red ears from the cold. He looked at her, looked at the traveling coat, looked at the absence of any attendant or guard. "My queen," he said. "Saddle Ardyn," she said. "The northern tack." He moved immediately. He didn't ask. Servants who worked the night shift in a royal palace learned quickly that certain questions were wrong answers. While he worked, Selene stood at Ardyn's stall and let the horse push his nose against her shoulder. She rested her forehead against his jaw for a moment. He smelled of hay and warm animal and the cold that seeped in through the stable walls, and it was the most real thing she had touched all night. "All right," she said, quietly, to no one. The groom brought her the horse, fully tacked, and held him while she mounted. Then he stepped back. He looked up at her from the stable floor, this 16-year-old boy whose name she had made a point of learning, Davan, with an expression of someone working very hard not to ask a question that was burning holes in him. She looked down at him. "If anyone asks," she said, "you did not see me." Davan nodded once. His jaw was set. Whatever he was thinking about loyalty, about who deserved it, about the gap between the oaths he'd been told mattered and the reality he'd spent the last several hours watching through stable windows, he kept it to himself. She touched her heels to Ardyn's flanks and rode out of the palace stable into the winter dark. The city of Ardyn spread out below the palace hill in the patterns of a settlement that had grown too fast, all cramped stone streets and unplanned alleys that made no sense from ground level but from the hill's vantage formed a kind of accidental logic. Selene knew the city the way she knew the palace, from years of walking it, which she had done without guards when Cedric was occupied and the crowds were manageable, because she had been raised to believe that a ruler who did not know what streets felt like under their feet would eventually ruin everyone on those streets from a comfortable distance. She rode through the lower city at a walk, hood up, taking the streets along the eastern wall where the night traffic was thinnest. A tavern window threw yellow light into the street. She heard voices inside, the rougher edges of real speech, the kind that happened when people who worked for a living sat down at the end of a day. A man laughing, two people arguing about something minor, the sound of ordinary life doing what it did, moving through time without reference to crowns or banquets or marriages that had run out of anything holding them together. She kept riding. At the north gate, the guards were two brothers. She recognized them by height, who had manned that post for 3 years. They came to attention when they heard the horse. "My queen." The taller one stepped forward with a lantern. His eyes moved across her, taking in the details. The traveling coat, the single horse, no escort. He was a veteran of the northern campaigns, which meant he had a soldier's instinct for tactical situations. What she was presenting to him was a tactical situation. "Open the gate," she said. A pause. "My queen, the hour is late. The roads north are iced." "I know the roads north." Another pause. Shorter. He was doing math, and the math was coming out in her favor. She was the queen. She had given him an order. He had no instructions that specifically contradicted this order, and whatever he personally thought about what he was looking at, the gap between personal thought and action was where discipline lived. He opened the gate. She rode through into the black road beyond the walls. The cold hit immediately. Not gradual, not creeping, but a full-body pressure from the air, the kind of cold the north produced in winter that wasn't just temperature, but weight. Her breath came out white. Ardyn's breath came out white. The road ahead was pale with frost, catching the half-moon's light, stretching out north into the tree line. She rode. For the first mile, she thought about nothing except the physical work. Keeping her seat on an iced road, reading Ardyn's balance, managing her own warmth, the immediate specific task of staying on. Then the city lights were behind her, then the sound of the walls was gone. Then it was just the road, and the dark, and the cold, and the horse under her, and she let herself think. She thought about the Thyran grain treaty and who would manage it now. She knew the answer. She had left enough documentation, had built enough institutional knowledge into Heron and Ashby that the treaty would survive without her for long enough to matter. She thought about the Delvath famine situation and the Eastern levy repairs. She had put mechanisms in motion that were self-sustaining for 2 months at minimum. She thought about the dozen other threads she had been holding simultaneously for the better part of 3 years, and she was honest with herself about which ones would fray without her hands on them. Some would. Some would fray badly. That knowledge sat in her chest alongside everything else, and she let it sit there without turning it into justification for going back. She had made a life out of justifying going back. She had spent 3 years absorbing a slow humiliation by telling herself that the kingdom needed her, which was true, and therefore she was required to endure whatever came attached to the kingdom, which was not. She had confused the work she loved with the life she was living inside. The horses at the northern way station would need water tomorrow, she thought, and almost laughed at herself. Even now, even here. Ardyn's hooves on the frozen road made a steady sound. She settled into it. Ahead, approximately 2 days' hard riding, lay the Veth Highlands, the territories where her father's bloodline had governed for 6 generations before the Southern Alliance had pulled them into Ardyn's political sphere. She had not been back since her marriage. Her mother's sister still kept a house there in the border town of Colrath, with warm fires and no one who would ask her to explain herself. She had not planned this. That was the thing she kept coming back to, turning it over with the kind of careful attention she gave to everything that surprised her. She had not planned it. There had been no moment of preparation, no weeks of careful arrangement, no correspondence with sympathetic parties in the north. She had sat at a banquet table, watched her husband dance, felt something let go inside her chest, and now she was here. That was not how Selene Vane operated. Selene Vane planned. Selene Vane calculated. Selene Vane built 7 contingencies before acting on one. And yet, she thought about the crown sitting on the bedside table in the warm firelight of her chambers. She thought about Davon's set jaw and the decision he had made in the dark of the stable. She thought about 23 stone faces looking down from the walls of a room built to make people feel small. The trees closed in on either side of the road. Branches overhead were white with ice, and the moon through them broke into fragments of light that shifted as she moved. It was beautiful in the way that cold things were, uncompromising, clarifying, entirely indifferent to whether you appreciated it. She rode faster. Behind her, in the palace on the hill, the winter banquet was still going, or it had ended. She wasn't thinking about it anymore. She was thinking about the Veth Highlands, about the smell of her aunt's kitchen fire, about the particular sound her father's language made when spoken by people who had never needed it to sound like anything other than what it was. She was thinking about what it felt like to know a place because you chose to know it, not because you were installed in it. She had ridden maybe an hour beyond the gate when she heard the horse behind her, single horse, fast, closing. She didn't slow down. She put her hand at her belt. She had brought no weapon, which was an oversight she noted without emotion, and kept her eyes on the road ahead, listening to the cadence. The other horse came alongside her. She turned her head. Heron. He was wrapped in a heavy northern coat, riding the way old soldiers rode, settled and efficient. His face in the half-dark was the face of a man who had made a decision and was executing it without any of the hesitation that decisions usually cost. They rode side by side for 10 seconds without speaking. "You left the crown," he said. "Yes." "On the bedside table." "Yes." He was quiet for another few strides. "I'm not going to ask you to go back." "Good. I'm going to ride with you until the way station. There are 3 horses there that belong to my household. You'll need remounts before Colrath." Selene looked at him. Heron kept his eyes on the road. His jaw was set the same way Davon's had been set, and she thought about what that meant, about the particular stubbornness of people who had watched something wrong happen and decided quietly, without announcement, that they would not participate in it anymore. "You'll lose your position," she said. "I've had positions before." He glanced at her sideways. "I'm 61. My wife has been after me to spend more time at the estate." Heron, Selene. He said her name without the title. He had never done that. The absence of the honorific was its own kind of statement. "The boy who held your horse, Davon, he'll tell no one until morning. That's 2 hours, possibly 3. He paused. "After that, when they find the crown and realize you're gone, it will be too late for anyone to catch you before Colrath." She held that information. Then she said, "He'll know I'm in the north." "Yes." "He'll come after me." "Eventually." Heron's voice was careful. "When the treaty falls apart because the Thyrans won't deal with Morel's people. When the grain reserves in Delvath fail because the distribution network you built needs someone who knows what they're doing to operate it. When the Dukes start refusing levies because the thing they were actually loyal to is gone." He paused. "He'll come north when the kingdom starts dying, and he finally understands that he didn't actually run any of it." The road ahead stretched white and empty into the dark. Selene felt the cold in her face, on her hands, through the layers of the traveling coat. She felt Aaron's rhythm under her. She heard the wind in the ice-weighted branches and the 2 horses breathing in the still night air. "How long do you think that takes?" she said. Heron thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. 6 months, he said. "Maybe 4, if Morel moves faster than I expect." 4 months. Selene looked up through the broken moonlight in the branches. 4 months in the north, in the country of her blood, with time to think for the first time in 11 years. 4 months for the architecture of quiet necessity to become visible to the man who had always taken it for granted. She thought about what 4 months could be. What could be built in that time, by a woman who knew how to build things, in the territories where people already respected the name she had been born with. Something shifted in her chest. Not hope, exactly. Not yet. Something colder and more honest than hope. The specific feeling of a mind that has accepted its circumstances and started calculating forward from the new position. "Ride faster," she said. They rode. 3 miles behind them, in the palace on the hill, the last candles of the winter banquet were burning down. The musicians had packed their instruments. The servants were clearing the remains of a meal that had cost enough to feed the Delvath province for a week. The guests had departed in clusters, and the talk moving with them was of the thing they had all witnessed: Careful talk, calculated talk. The kind of conversation that didn't commit to anything because commitment was expensive when a court was shifting. In the king's private chambers, Cedric Vane was laughing at something Morel had said. In the queen's chambers, a crown sat on a bedside table beside a cooling fireplace, the silver gone cold now, the firelight nothing but embers. In the morning, when the chambermaid came to light the fire and found the room empty and the crown alone on the table, she stood for a long moment in the silence of those chambers. Then she walked out and closed the door very quietly behind her. And in the stable below, Davin, who had been raised in this palace, who had grown up watching a queen hold together a kingdom with her bare hands while a king held someone else's, looked up at the dark north road from the stable door. He kept looking long after there was nothing left to see. 4 months later, when the first grain riots broke out in the eastern provinces, and Cedric's treasury minister arrived at court with a face the color of old ash to report that the Thyran Confederacy had refused to honor the treaty, citing the instability of Ardyn's current political leadership, the king stood at the window of his throne room and stared out at a city that had started to feel unfamiliar. He sent riders north that same afternoon. Every single one of them came back empty-handed, because what they found in the Veth Highlands was not a refugee, was not a broken woman waiting to be retrieved, was not the quiet, dignified exile of a wife who had endured too much. What they found, what one pale-faced rider finally reported at the end of the third week, standing in Cedric's throne room with mud on his boots and something shaken behind his eyes, was a court, not a palace, not a fortress. A functioning political structure built in 4 months by a woman who had spent 11 years learning how to build things that lasted in the territory of her birth, with the loyalty of leaders who had been watching from the north and waiting to see what she would do once she had the room to do it. The writer said she had 300 soldiers, a trade agreement with 2 neighboring states. The full backing of the Veth Council, who had not formally recognized Ardyn's authority over the Highlands in 16 years, and had been waiting, apparently, for exactly this moment. He said she had sent no message. He said, and this was the part that made Cedric sit down slowly into his throne, he said that when he identified himself as the king's envoy and requested an audience, the guard at the gates of Colrath had told him, with polite finality, that the queen received visitors on Tuesdays. Today was Thursday. In the east, the grain riots were spreading. In the south, Lord Cassidin's merchant fleets had begun rerouting north. In the throne room of a palace built to make men feel small, Cedric Vane sat alone in the amber afternoon light and understood for the first time in his life that he had not been running a kingdom. He had been living inside of one, and she had taken it with her when she left. The riders came back on a Thursday. Cedric sat with that information for the better part of an hour before he trusted himself to speak to anyone. He dismissed the envoy with a flat hand gesture and sat alone in the throne room while the afternoon light moved across the floor and the sound of the palace went about its ordinary business around him, indifferent. The queen received visitors on Tuesdays. He turned that over in his mind the way you turn something sharp over, carefully, aware of the edges. There was a message in it, not the words, which were just logistics, but the architecture of the thing. The choice to receive visitors on a specific day of the week meant there were enough visitors to warrant a schedule. A schedule meant volume. Volume meant she had been busy enough in 4 months to need to organize her time. He stood up and walked to the window. The city of Ardyn spread below the palace hill in the late afternoon light, and it looked the same as it always had. The cramped streets, the market district, the river threading east toward the port. But there were things you couldn't see from this height. He knew that now in a way he hadn't known it 2 years ago. The grain warehouses in the Delvath district that were half empty. The eastern road where merchant carts had thinned to a trickle. The docks where 3 of Cassidin's flagship vessels had not returned from their last northern run because Cassidin had quietly, without announcement or confrontation, begun routing them elsewhere. Cedric was not a stupid man. That had always been part of the problem, in a way. He was intelligent enough to understand what was happening. He had simply spent 11 years calculating that the cost of not changing was lower than the cost of change, and the calculation had been running on a false variable, the assumption that everything holding steady around him was the result of his own competence. He heard Morel's footsteps in the corridor before she appeared. He had learned her walk the way you learned anything you spent enough time close to, involuntarily, by accumulation. The specific cadence of it, the weight she put on the right foot, the soft sound her rings made against the door frame when she pushed it open. She came in without knocking. She had stopped knocking sometime in the second month after Selene left. "The council meeting is in an hour," she said. She crossed to the side table where wine was kept and poured herself a cup without asking. "Varen wants to discuss the Eastern tariff adjustments again. I told him you'd already decided." "I haven't decided." "You have." She turned. She had dressed today in the structured, formal style she adopted for council days. Dark fabric, minimal jewelry, the look of a woman presenting herself as an administrator rather than an ornament. It was calculated and it was effective, and Cedric noticed both things simultaneously. The tariffs stay at current rates. Cutting them signals weakness to the merchant lords at exactly the moment we can't afford to signal weakness. Keeping them at current rates is why Cassidon's ships stopped coming south. Cassidon's ships stopped coming south because his loyalties were always with the Queen. She said it flatly. Not with heat. The absence of heat was its own kind of statement. We're not going to win Cassidon back with tariff adjustments. We're going to build a replacement network through the western ports. The western ports are Heron's territory. Heron is in the north. She said his name the way she said all names she'd decided didn't matter anymore, with the specific brevity of a woman who had filed the person in question under resolved. His son manages the western estates now. Aldrich is 24 and he's practical. He can be worked with. Cedric looked at her. He had been doing this more lately. This looking, this actual examination of the person in front of him rather than the idea of her. In the months when Selene was still here and Morel was the dangerous bright thing at the edge of his life, he had not needed to examine Morel closely. She had been a feeling more than a person. She had been the specific sensation of choosing himself over everything else, which had felt, at the time, like freedom. Now she was standing in his throne room discussing political strategy with the matter-of-fact possession of someone who lived here. "You talked to Aldrich already," he said. A pause. Not hesitation. She didn't hesitate, but the kind of pause that acknowledged he had seen something correctly. "I had a preliminary conversation. I wanted to know if it was worth bringing to you." "And?" "It's worth bringing to you." Cedric turned back to the window. "What did you promise him?" "I didn't promise him anything." "Morel." Another pause. Shorter. "I suggested that a man who helped stabilize the Western trade corridor during a difficult period would be remembered generously when positions in the trade ministry were restructured." Restructured. He filed that word. "The trade ministry isn't being restructured," he said. "Not yet." Her voice was even, informational. "Varen is 72. He's been managing those accounts the same way for 16 years, and the world those methods were built for doesn't exist anymore. The restructuring is coming whether we manage it or not." He turned around. She met his gaze. She had amber eyes that she used with a precision he had always found compelling, and now found not troubling exactly, something more specific than troubling. He was looking at a woman who had been building something, and she was not being hidden about it. And the fact that she was not being hidden about it was its own kind of message, because Morel was too smart to show him anything she didn't intend for him to see. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She crossed her legs and held her wine cup in both hands and waited. "Tell me what you actually think is happening," he said. The question surprised her. He saw it, a fractional widening of her eyes, quickly gone. He had not asked her that before. He had used her intelligence as a tool without treating it as a thing that had an independent perspective, which was, he recognized now, precisely the same thing he had done with Selene, expressed in a different register. "What I actually think," she said slowly, "is that Selene's departure created a structural vacuum that is filling faster than you realize, and that the people filling it are not all doing so in your interest." "Including you?" The directness of it hung in the room. Morel looked at him for a long moment. "I'm here," she said. "I'm in this room, in this palace, tied to a crown that's losing credibility by the week. If I were acting against your interest, I would be in the north. Some would say the smart play is to be in both places." "Some would." She held his gaze. "I'm not that smart." He didn't believe that. and she knew he didn't, and neither of them acknowledged it. "The council meeting," he said. "Go." She left. Masit. The council chamber was a room Cedric had always found comfortable in the way that familiar things were comfortable. Not pleasurable, but known. The long table, the 7 chairs, the maps on the western wall that he had stopped actually reading sometime in the 3rd year of his reign because Selene had been reading them, and she had always told him what he needed to know. He walked in and took his chair and looked at the faces around the table. Varen, 72, white-haired, building his case around a stack of ledger papers. Lord Cassander from the Internal Affairs Ministry, who had the specific look of a man who had been sleeping poorly. 2 military advisors he trusted in the field and not in rooms. A trade representative from the southern provinces, whose name he kept forgetting. And Morel, at the table's far end, hands folded. "Your Majesty," Varen began. The meeting ran for 90 minutes. Cedric sat at the head of the table and listened to 7 people describe, in the careful language of bureaucratic professionals, the progressive failure of systems he had not understood well enough to protect. The grain distribution network in the eastern provinces, the tariff framework that had been written with Thyran cooperation in mind and was now missing one of its 2 foundational parties, the debt instruments that had been structured against anticipated treaty revenues that were no longer anticipated. Every problem on this table, he thought, looking at Varen's ledger, had a solution he couldn't see clearly because he was only now learning to see the problem. Selene would have seen all of this 6 months ago. The thought arrived without drama, without the defensive reflex he would have expected from himself, which told him something about how much had shifted. It was simply true. She had seen it, she had been managing it, and he had sat in rooms like this one for years, and mistaken the absence of audible crisis for the absence of work. "The Delvath situation," he said, cutting across Varen's summary. Varen stopped. "Yes, Your Majesty." "The distribution network. Who built it?" A pause around the table. Cassander looked at the wall. "The network was designed and implemented under Queen Selene's administration," Varen said carefully. "In the 2nd year of who runs it now. The regional coordinators she appointed still hold their positions. However, without the central coordination from the palace, the network has been," Varen chose his word with visible effort, "fragmenting." "How fast?" "Faster than we projected." Cedric looked at Morel. She was watching him with no expression. "What would it take to restabilize it?" he said. "The honest answer," Cassander said, with the specific courage of a man who had decided the meeting was going badly enough that honesty couldn't make it worse, "is someone with Queen Selene's institutional knowledge of how the network was built." The room went very quiet. Cedric sat with that in the silence for long enough that it became its own kind of statement. Then he nodded once. "Varen," he said, "I want a full accounting of every operational system in the kingdom that the Queen built or managed personally. Not what the ministry headings say. What she actually touched. I want it on my desk by end of week." "Your Majesty, that's—" Varen stopped, started again. "That's a significant scope." "I know." He stood up. The council stood with him. "We're done," he said. The accounting arrived 3 days later in a leather-bound volume that Varen had organized with the thoroughness of a man terrified of being blamed for something. Cedric sat with it alone in his study for the better part of an afternoon. It was 43 pages. He read all of it. The grain distribution network, the Thyran treaty management, the Eastern levy schedules, the emergency storage protocols, the foreign dignitary correspondence framework, the allocation system for the Crown's charitable obligations, the management structure for the Queen's household staff, who had apparently also been performing significant administrative functions he had not known about. Page after page of documented systems, each one carefully described, each one now operating at reduced capacity or not at all. 43 pages. He thought about the morning Selene had come to him 3 years ago and told him the Delvath harvest projections were running below safe margins and they needed to build emergency reserves now, not in spring. He had been irritated. He had been in the middle of something. He had told her to handle it, which was what he always told her, and she had handled it, which was what she always did. He had not asked how. He closed the volume. He sat for a long time looking at the fire. Then he heard Morel in the corridor outside. Two voices, hers and someone else's. A man's, low and direct, the kind of voice that adjusted its volume specifically for conversations it didn't want overheard. He sat very still and listened. He caught fragments. Not enough. The conversation ended. A door closed somewhere in the east corridor. Cedric waited 3 minutes. Then he stood up and walked out. The east corridor was empty. The door to the map room was closed but not latched. It sat a half-inch open, which meant someone had pulled it shut quickly. He pushed it open. A man he didn't recognize was standing at the map table. Not a servant, not a guard. He was dressed as a minor court official, which was the costume choice of someone who had calculated that minor court officials were not looked at. He was 30, compact, with the particular stillness of people whose profession involved standing in rooms they weren't supposed to be in. He turned when the door opened. "Your Majesty," he said, with the smooth recovery of a professional. He bent into a bow. "Who are you?" Cedric said. "Lord Aldrich's correspondence secretary, Your Majesty. Lady Morel asked me to—" "Get out." The man got out. Cedric stood in the map room and looked at the table. One of the maps had been moved, the Northern Territories map, the one that covered the Veth Highlands. It had been laid flat in the center of the table instead of its usual position on the side rack. Someone had been looking at Colrath. He stood at that table for a long time, the thing that had been forming at the back of his mind for the last 3 weeks. The thing he had been keeping peripheral, not looking at directly the way you didn't look directly at something that would require you to act if you acknowledged it, stepped forward into the light. Morel had made a preliminary conversation with Aldrich. Aldrich's secretary was looking at maps of the North in rooms he hadn't been invited into. Morel was not just filling a vacuum. Morel was doing what Morel had always done. She was calculating the board, and she was calculating it independently of him. And the maps of the North were not the maps of a woman who was planning to bring Selene back. They were the maps of a woman who was planning to make sure Selene stayed there. He thought about what that meant for the grain treaty, for the Eastern Province riots that his military advisors were calling manageable and his gut was calling something else, for 43 pages of systems that were fragmenting without the hands that built them. He thought about what it meant that Morel had been the one to propose his own envoy mission to the North, had framed it as due diligence, had helped select which riders to send, had been standing right there when they came back empty-handed, and he had sat alone with the information while she refilled her wine cup. The envoys. He thought about the envoys. He had sent 7 riders north over 3 weeks. All 7 had returned saying the same thing. She would not receive them. Politely declined. Tuesday appointments only. He had accepted that at face value because he was still processing the shock of what she had built. Now he stood in front of a map with Aldrich's secretary's fingerprints on it and asked himself a different question. Had Morel chosen those riders? He walked out of the map room and went directly to the stables. Not his usual horse. That one was stabled in the royal wing, tended by grooms who reported to the head steward, who reported to Cassander, who was a careful man in a court that was suddenly full of people calculating angles. He saddled a secondary horse himself. His hands remembered the work even if it had been years. The horse, a bay gelding, plain, the kind that did not get remembered, stood patiently while he worked. He left through the south gate, which was not the gate anyone would be watching. He rode alone for the first time in longer than he could clearly recall. The city moved around him the way it moved around anyone on a plain horse in unremarkable clothing, without interest. He rode through the market district, through the eastern residential streets, into the lower district where the grain warehouses were. He tied the horse to a post outside a tavern and walked. The first warehouse was locked. The second was open. He walked in. The warehouse held perhaps a third of what it should have held in late autumn. He stood in the cold interior and looked at rows of half-filled storage bays and breathed the smell of a building that had been full recently and wasn't anymore. A man appeared from the back. The warehouse manager, gray-haired, heavy-set, with the specific wariness of a man who had spent months fielding questions he couldn't answer satisfactorily. "You're—" The man stopped. He had recognized Cedric's face and was now processing the absence of anything that should accompany it. No guards, no attendants, just a man in a plain coat in a half-empty warehouse. "How long has it been at this level?" Cedric said. The manager swallowed. 6 weeks, Your Majesty. The Northern Resupply Convoy that was scheduled for... Who was supposed to authorize it? Minister Varen's office had the paperwork, but the manager stopped again. "Say it." "The distribution authorization required the Queen's seal, Your Majesty. The emergency protocols were built that way. To prevent..." He stopped a third time. "To prevent misappropriation." Selene had built a safeguard into the emergency food supply that required her personal authorization, because she had known, at some level, that she couldn't trust everyone around her, including, probably, the man standing in front of this manager right now. Cedric stood in the half-empty warehouse and breathed. "Go home," he told the manager. The man left fast. Cedric stood alone in the warehouse for a long time. The cold of the storage space settled into his coat. He could hear the street outside. Voices, carts, the ordinary movement of people who were not yet in crisis, but were close enough to it that they could feel the temperature of the air changing. His kingdom was a building with the load-bearing walls removed. He had removed them himself, one by one, across 11 years, each time he chose the easier thing over the right thing. Each time he handed her a problem and turned away before she could show him how she was solving it. Each time the room was fine at the end of the day, and he credited himself for the room being fine. He had torn out everything that held the structure up and lived happily in the shell, wondering why it was so light and easy. He walked out of the warehouse. He rode back to the palace. He went straight to his chambers and sat down at the writing desk that he used for personal correspondence, not the state desk, not the one Morel had access to. And he wrote a letter, not to Varen, not to the council, not to Heron, who was in the north now and whose loyalties had made their declaration. He wrote to Selene. He wrote it the way a man wrote who had spent a long time learning to perform competence and was now sitting in the wreckage of the performance and had nothing left to protect. He did not ask her to come back. He did not make arguments about the kingdom or the people or the grain reserves. He wrote 4 sentences, and he meant all 4 of them, which was more honesty than he had put on paper and longer than he wanted to count. He sealed it himself. He did not give it to any courier in the palace. He rode south to the city's messenger quarter and paid a private rider, an old man who operated independently, who had run letters for merchants and private parties for 30 years, and whose discretion was professional rather than political, with his own personal funds. He gave the rider the letter and told him to go north. He rode back to the palace. He walked into the east corridor and pushed open the door to the map room again. The Northern Territories map was still on the table. He stood over it and looked at Colrath. He was still standing there, one hand flat on the table, when Morel appeared in the doorway behind him. "The Eastern Province governors are requesting an emergency audience," she said. "When?" "They arrived this afternoon, all 3 of them, together." 3 governors arriving together was not a request. It was a declaration. It meant they had coordinated the trip, which meant they had been in correspondence, which meant this was a unified position and not 3 separate complaints. "Where are they?" he said. "The East receiving room. I had them given wine and told them you were in council." "I wasn't in council." "I know." She held the doorway with one shoulder against the frame. The amber eyes were reading him, the map under his hand, his posture, the specific tension in his jaw that she knew the architecture of better than most. "What do you want to do with them?" He looked at the map. He looked at the line of the northern road drawn in faded ink that led from Ardyn's gates to the Veth Highlands, to the border town of Colrath. He thought about the letter in a private rider's saddlebag, moving north through the dark. He thought about Aldrich's secretary and the position map and what Morel had been building in rooms he wasn't watching. He thought about 43 pages. He turned around. "I'll see them," he said. He walked past her toward the East receiving room. She watched him go. And in the East receiving room, 3 governors who had ridden 2 weeks to stand in the same place at the same time were about to tell the king of Ardyn that the eastern districts were 90 days from open revolt. In the palace's private wine cellar, behind the secondary pantry that no one checked because no one checked secondary pantries, 2 servants, both hired within the last 4 months, both carrying letters of recommendation from Lord Aldrich's western estates, were grinding something fine and white into a powder between two smooth stones. Neither of them worked for Cedric. Neither of them worked for Selene. They worked for the woman standing in the corridor of the map room with her shoulder against the door frame, watching the king walk away from her toward a meeting she had arranged, in a room she had chosen, with men she had known were coming for 2 weeks before she told him. The three governors were not men who scared easily. Cedric had known all of them for years, known them in the way kings knew provincial lords, which was to say he knew their titles and their grievances and the specific texture of their loyalty, which had always been the conditional kind. They governed the eastern districts because the eastern districts were hard country, river-flooded in spring and wind-scoured in winter, full of people who worked the land with both hands and had no patience for anyone who didn't. Governor Aldous of Delvath was the oldest, 64, built like a man who had spent 30 years doing something physical before he started doing something political. Governor Rhine of the River District was 50, quiet, with the specific economy of movement that came from managing large amounts of complicated information. Governor Caswell of the Border Provinces was 42, and had the youngest face of the three, which was misleading because his eyes were older than the rest of him by about 20 years. They stood when Cedric entered the East receiving room. They did not bow. Not the full bow, just the head inclination that technically satisfied the protocol while leaving no ambiguity about the temperature of the room. Cedric sat. He gestured for them to sit. He did not call for wine. "You rode together," he said. "Yes," Aldous said. "How long were you planning this trip before you told my office?" A pause. The three men exchanged nothing visible, no glance, no gesture, but something moved between them, the way it moved between people who had already had all their arguments before they walked through the door. 3 weeks, Rain said. Cedric absorbed that. 3 weeks of coordination they had not disclosed. 3 weeks during which his court had been operating on the assumption that the eastern provinces were unhappy but manageable, which was the assessment Cassander had been giving him, and which Cassander had gotten from, he traced it back, from Morel's intelligence summaries. "Tell me what's actually happening," he said. Aldous leaned forward. "The grain reserves in Delvath are at critical levels, Your Majesty. We have maybe 6 weeks before we're rationing. Not the kind of rationing that's uncomfortable, the kind that produces bodies." "The emergency protocols?" "The emergency protocols require the Queen's seal." Aldous said it without heat, without accusation, as a man stated a physical fact about a wall he kept running into. "We have submitted 4 formal requests to the palace for emergency authorization under interim arrangements. We have received 3 acknowledgements and no action." "Who received those requests here?" "Minister Varen's office." Cedric was quiet. Rain said carefully, "Your Majesty, we are not here to assign blame for past decisions. We are here because we have 300,000 people in the eastern districts who will start dying in spring if something doesn't change between now and then. That is the only reason we're in this room." "What do you need from me?" Caswell spoke for the first time. He had the border accent, clipped, direct, the sound of a man raised where negotiation was a luxury and plain speech was a survival skill. "We need the Queen." The room held that sentence for a moment. "The systems she built are locked to her authorization," Caswell continued, "not because she was protecting her own position. Because she was protecting against exactly this situation, someone using the emergency food supply as a political instrument. We've watched 2 of Cassander's deputy ministers try to redirect Delvath emergency stores to the capital warehouses in the last month. The lock held, but the lock also means we can't open the stores we need." "I can override." "With respect, Your Majesty," Aldous said, "your override authority on the emergency distribution network was restructured in the 3rd year of the Queen's administration. She rewrote the authorization chain to require dual confirmation, crown and consort, precisely because a single crown override was vulnerable to coercion." He paused. "She may have been thinking about coercion from external threats, but the architecture works the same regardless of where the coercion is coming from. The architecture works the same regardless of where the coercion is coming from." Cedric sat with that. The fire in the East receiving room was well built, good heat, steady, and he was aware of it on his face the way you became aware of warmth when the cold in your chest got cold enough. She had built a system that protected the food supply from him specifically. She might not have named it that way, might not have sat at her desk and written, "This prevents Cedric from doing something stupid with the emergency grain." But she had understood at some level that the weakest point in any system she built was the man she shared a crown with, and she had engineered around him. He could not decide whether to be furious or grateful. He sat with both feelings simultaneously and let them cancel each other into something colder and more useful. "I'll go north myself," he said. The three governors looked at him. "I'll go to Colrath, and I will request an audience with the Queen, and I will ask her directly to authorize the Eastern emergency distribution." He said it the way he said things when he had decided them and didn't need anyone to confirm the decision. "Whatever the political situation between us, she is not going to let 300,000 people starve to settle a personal score. That is not who she is." Aldous said nothing. Rhine said nothing. Caswell looked at the fire. "No," he said. "It isn't." "Go back to your districts," Cedric said. "Buy me 4 weeks. Ishcham." He left the East receiving room and walked directly to his private chambers. He did not tell Morel. He did not tell Cassander. He did not tell Varen. He wrote a short note to his head of personal guard, a man named Breck, 47, former Northern Campaigns veteran, whose loyalty Cedric trusted because he had tested it, and because Breck's family came from Delvath, and Breck knew what was at stake in that province the way only someone with family there could know, and told him to have horses ready at the south stable at dawn. Riding clothes, 6 guards, all from Breck's personal selection, no one from the ceremonial unit. Then he went to bed. He didn't sleep. He lay in the dark of the king's chambers and listened to the palace breathe around him, the distant sound of a night guard's boots on the corridor stone, the settling of old walls in the winter cold, the wind against the high windows. He had made a mistake 11 years long, and he was going to go north to ask the woman he had made it against to please if she could find it in herself, help him fix part of it before people died. That was the sentence, stripped down to its actual shape. He lay with it until the fire in the grate went to coals. Asem. He was dressed and at the south stable before dawn. Breck was there with 6 horses and 6 men he trusted. No ceremony, no announcement, plain coats, practical gear, the look of a traveling party that was not asking to be recognized. They rode out as the sky was still gray. 3 days' ride to Colrath if they pushed. The road north was iced but passable. Cedric rode with his hood up and his mind working, going over the conversation he would need to have, and not finding a version of it that he liked. He was an hour outside the city when the first rider caught up with them. Not one of his. The horse was running hard from the direction of the city, and the rider was one of the palace household staff, young, breathing ragged from the gallop, pulling up alongside Breck at the column's front. "Your Majesty." The rider's voice was off, something in it beyond the exertion. "You need to return to the palace." "I don't," Cedric said. "Your Majesty." The rider looked at him directly. "Lord Varen is dead, and the council chamber—" He stopped, pulled a breath. "Lady Morel has called an emergency session of the full council, and she is presenting documentation." Cedric looked at him for a long moment. "What documentation?" he said. "I don't know the full contents, Your Majesty. What I know is that Lord Cassander is already there, and so is General Aveth and Minister Holt, and another breath, and the palace gates have been locked from the inside. The south gate, the one you came through, Lord Breck's code worked because it runs on the personal authentication system, but the main gates are closed." Cedric turned and looked at Breck. Breck's face had gone, the specific flat that trained soldiers' faces went when they were performing triage. "Varen," Cedric said. "How?" "They're calling it sudden illness, Your Majesty. He was found in his offices this morning." Sudden illness. The fine white powder. The secondary pantry. 2 servants with letters of recommendation from Aldrich's western estates. The cold in his chest relocated to his spine. "Turn around," he said. They rode back hard. The south gate opened for Breck's authentication code. The palace interior was wrong before Cedric reached the main building. The wrong guards at the wrong positions. That specific spatial grammar of a security arrangement that had been reorganized while his back was turned. He saw it in the placements, in the faces he didn't recognize at doors he knew. He didn't stop walking. He went straight to the council chamber. He pushed the doors open. The room was full. All 7 council seats occupied. General Aveth standing near the maps. 3 men he didn't recognize positioned near the door he had just come through. Morel at the far end of the table, in the chair that was not technically hers, with papers spread in front of her and both hands flat on the table. And Cassander sitting to her left, who met Cedric's eyes and then looked away. The look that looked away told him everything he needed to know about Cassander. "Your Majesty," Morel said. Her voice was level, completely level, the way a foundation was level, structural, load-bearing. "Please, sit down." "What is this?" Cedric said. "It's a council session. Please sit." "I did not call a council session." "No." She folded her hands. The amber eyes were steady, not cold. That would have been easier to read. Just steady, with the specific quality of someone executing a plan they had been carrying for long enough that the execution felt ordinary. "I called it. Under Article 14 of the Royal Governance Charter, a council session can be called by any sitting minister in the presence of a demonstrated administrative emergency. Varen is dead." "Yes." Something moved across her face. Not grief. Acknowledgement. "Lord Varen died this morning. He had been in declining health for some time." She gestured at the papers in front of her, "which is part of what requires this session. His ministry has been managing several critical accounts in a state of significant disorganization. The documentation I have here—" "Stop." The room went very quiet. Cedric walked to the table. He did not sit down. He stood at his end of it with both hands loose at his sides and looked at every face in the room. Cassander, still studying the table. The 2 military advisors, neither of whom met his eyes, which answered his question about whether they were his anymore. Holt, the trade minister, who was looking at Cedric with the specific expression of a man on a ship that had started taking water and who hadn't yet decided which lifeboat to get on. He looked at Morel last. "Where's the man from Aldrich's office?" he said. "The one I found in the map room." A pause. "I don't know who you mean." "The one looking at maps of the Northern Territories. The one who works for a 24-year-old I've never personally vetted who manages the western estates of a lord who left for the north 8 months ago." Morel said nothing. "How long?" Cedric said. "Your Majesty, how long have you been building this?" The silence lasted long enough to be an answer. "Since before Selene left," he said. Her jaw moved, just slightly. "The kingdom needed stable management. The kingdom needed her." He said it without volume, which was worse than saying it loudly because it had the sound of something that was just true, not argued. "And you made sure she left." The room had stopped breathing. Morel's eyes didn't waver. "She left because you danced with me in front of 1,000 people. You told me to do that. You chose to." The accuracy of it hit him somewhere behind the sternum. He held it there, didn't look away from it. "Yes," he said, "I did." She held his gaze. The amber eyes were doing something he hadn't seen in them before. Not triumph, not the warm satisfaction of someone winning a long game. Something that was almost tired. "I didn't poison Varen," she said. "I know you didn't do it yourself. I did not order it done." Each word separate and deliberate. "Aldrich's men were in this palace because I was building a supply chain. Varen's death is—" She stopped. Something moved across her face that he couldn't fully read. "That was not part of what I planned. But you'll use it. Someone has to." The rawness of it, the plain practical brutality of it, was almost more honest than anything she had said to him in months. Someone has to. The kingdom is collapsing. Someone has to hold it. And since the person who knew how was gone, and since you had not known enough to keep her, someone with ambition and intelligence and a willingness to use both was going to step into the space. She was not wrong about the logic. She was just wrong about the outcomes. And she was going to find that out in a way he couldn't stop anymore. "What's in the documentation?" he said. "Evidence of administrative failures across Varen's ministry that require immediate restructuring. Transfer of emergency authorization powers to a council committee pending reestablishment of stable governance." She paused. and a formal request for you to suspend active administrative authority while the committee conducts a review. Suspend active administrative authority. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Cassander. Is this your position? Cassander's jaw tightened. The kingdom needs stability, Your Majesty. General Aveth? The general's posture was the posture of a man who had chosen and was not enjoying the choice. The eastern provinces are at flashpoint. Someone needs to move now. And the council believes Lady Morel is that someone. No one answered. No one needed to. Cedric looked down at the table. He looked at the wood grain of it, the scratch near the western edge that had been there for 20 years, the water ring from some long-ago cup that had not been coasters properly. He had sat at this table for 15 years, and he had not, until approximately 3 weeks ago, understood what was actually being decided in this room and by whom. He thought about the private rider moving north through the frozen roads with a 4-sentence letter in his saddlebag. He thought about what Morel would do if he was suspended from authority, sitting in his own palace while she ran the council. What she would do about the northern territories, about the alliance Selene was building, about the woman who was the actual structural problem from Morel's perspective, the only person whose return would end everything Morel was building. He thought about Aldrich's secretary and the maps of Colrath. He thought about Selene in the north, 4 months into building something she had no reason to believe was threatened yet, surrounded by people who trusted her and had no intelligence apparatus watching the palace because no one had told her that watching the palace had become urgent. His letter was 4 sentences. It was honest, but it was not informative. It said nothing about Morel, about Varen, about the powder in the secondary pantry, or the locked gates or the council session that was happening right now. Because he had not known those things when he wrote it. He had sent a letter to a woman asking for help. He had not sent a warning. He looked up at Morel. If I sign the suspension, he said, what happens to the grain distribution? The committee takes over authorization. With what authentication? The system requires the Queen's seal. We're working on a technical resolution. There is no technical resolution. Selene built it specifically so there wasn't one. He watched her face. Which means your plan is to approach her directly, using whatever authority you've just taken from me, and compel her cooperation. Morel said nothing. And if she doesn't cooperate, he said. The room was very, very quiet. He saw it. Not in her face, she was too controlled for that. He saw it in Cassander's slight shift in his chair, in Aveth's eyes going to the window, in the 2 men near the door who were not council members and were not guards in the normal sense, and whose presence in this room meant something specific about what kind of options were being kept available. She was not going to ask Selene to cooperate. She was going to go north with enough force to make cooperation irrelevant. And then Selene, the woman who had built an alliance of warriors and merchants and neighboring rulers, who had 300 soldiers and a trade agreement with 2 states, who had Heron and 4 months of preparation, was going to be in the path of something coming from the south that she had no idea was coming. Because Cedric had sent 4 sentences instead of a warning. The full weight of it arrived in his body all at once, not in his head, not as a thought, but as a physical thing in his chest and his hands and somewhere behind his eyes. The cold spread outward from his sternum into his arms. His breathing was controlled only because he had learned very recently what things cost when you let them run. He had betrayed her twice. The first time was the slow way, across 11 years, the death by 1,000 comfortable choices. That one he had understood. He had named it, in the warehouse and at the writing desk and in the dark of the king's chambers. The second time was this morning, when he had ridden north thinking about what he needed and not about what might be hunting her from behind. He stood at the head of the council table in the palace his ancestors had built to make men feel small, and he understood, with the bone-deep clarity of a man who had just run out of room to be wrong, that there were 2 things he could do in the next 60 seconds. He could sign the suspension. He could retain his position in the palace, maintain some theoretical threat of authority, and watch from inside the walls while Morel sent force north toward the woman who had already survived everything Ardyn had thrown at her. Or he could refuse. Refusing meant the 3 men near the door became a different kind of problem. It meant Cassander's face went one way or the other, and Aveth's hand moved or didn't, and what happened in the next several minutes would not be a council procedure anymore. He looked at Breck, who was standing at his left shoulder and had been standing there, still and present, since they'd walked through the door. Breck's eyes were already on him. Cedric looked at the door behind the three men who weren't guards. He looked at Morel. She looked back at him, and in her face, for just a moment, was something that was almost regret. The specific regret of a person who had built something and was watching the final piece lock into place and finding that the satisfaction they expected was not quite what arrived. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "please don't make this worse." He thought about 300,000 people in the eastern provinces. He thought about Selene in Colrath on a Tuesday, receiving visitors with her hands still. He thought about 4 sentences. "Breck," he said, "Your Majesty." "The South Gate." A pause that lasted 1 heartbeat. "Still open," Breck said. Cedric turned and walked toward the door. The 3 men moved. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not clean, and it was not without cost, and 2 of Breck's 6 men paid for it in blood before the south corridor was clear. Cedric ran. Not the run of a man panicking, the run of a man executing, covering ground, with Breck at his shoulder and the remaining guards around him in the formation that soldiers used when the mission was to get one person out and everything else was secondary. The south gate was open. They went through it at a dead run. Behind them, the palace gates, the main ones, the ones that faced the city, began to close. And in the council chamber, Morel looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then she looked at Cassander. Then she looked at Aveth. "Send riders north," she said, "fast ones. I want them ahead of him." They rode north with the palace at their backs, and no plan worth the name. Breck had 3 men left. One was bleeding from a cut along his jaw that had gone deep enough to need stitching and wasn't going to get it. The horses they'd taken from the south stable were good animals, but not rested. Cedric had ridden 2 of them hard yesterday and not thought about what he'd need them for today. The road north was ice over gravel, the sky the flat white of a winter morning that wasn't going to get brighter, and somewhere behind them, Morel's fast riders were already moving. Cedric rode and did not look back. He had been calculating since the south gate. The numbers were not good. Morel had Aveth, which meant she had the military infrastructure, the courier network, the garrison commanders who answered to the general's office, the relay stations along the northern road that could put fresh horses under her riders every 40 miles. He had 4 men, tired horses, and the fact that Breck had been born in the north and knew alternate routes that weren't on the standard military maps. That last thing was the only variable working for him. "The Calvin cut," Breck said, pulling alongside him. His voice was flat and professional, the wound along his jaw seeping into his collar without him acknowledging it. "Goes through the Calvin Duke's territory. Longer by about 8 miles, but it bypasses the relay station at Thornmere. They'll have riders at Thornmere already." "Yes." "Calvin cut," Cedric said. They left the main road at the next junction. The Calvin cut was exactly what it sounded like. A working road, not a military road, worn down by agricultural carts and local traffic, running between hedgerows and field walls that gave them cover from the open ground on either side. It was slower than the main road. It was also invisible to anyone who didn't know it existed, and the people who knew it existed were people who had grown up in this territory or served in the northern campaigns under commanders who memorized alternate routes as a professional habit. Breck had done both. They rode hard through the morning. Cedric let his body do the riding and let his mind work the problem. He was aware, in a way he had not been 2 months ago, that his mind worked better when he wasn't protecting it from the conclusions it was trying to reach. He had spent 11 years keeping his intelligence at a careful distance from certain categories of information. Specifically, any information that would have required him to change something about how he was living. That was its own kind of exhaustion, it turned out. Keeping the walls up took more energy than most people realized until the walls came down. Without them, the thinking was faster, and it hurt more, and it was more useful. What he knew: Morel's riders had a head start on the main road and fresh horses from the relay stations. They would reach Colrath first. What they would do when they got there depended on what orders Morel had given them, and he did not know those orders specifically, but he knew Morel's logic, and he knew what he would do if he were building toward what she was building toward. She needed the authorization system unlocked. She needed Selene to cooperate or be removed from the equation. Fast riders meant she was trying to reach Colrath before Cedric could, which meant she understood that the variable she couldn't control was what Cedric would say when he got there. She was not sending riders to have a conversation. He rode faster. Around midday, they came through the back end of the Calvin Cut and rejoined a secondary road that ran parallel to the main north route. The relay station at Thornmere was 3 miles to the east. They gave it 3 miles of distance and kept moving. One of Breck's 3 men, a young soldier named Darren, whose family Cedric did not know and was now making a point of learning, pulled his horse alongside and said quietly, "There's smoke to the east, sir. Too much for a cook fire." Cedric looked. A dark column, rising maybe 2 miles off, in the direction of a village he knew sat along the main road. He looked at Breck. Breck's face was doing the triage calculation. Morel's riders wouldn't burn a village. Morel's riders are organized military personnel with orders. Cedric watched the smoke. That's not military, that's something came apart, something that was already under pressure. The grain riots from the eastern provinces, spreading west, moving faster than Cassander's assessment had indicated, because Cassander's assessments had been passing through Morel's editorial process. He turned away from the smoke and kept riding north, not because he didn't care. The specific weight of turning away from that smoke and continuing was something he would carry for a long time, but because the math was merciless. He could turn east and spend an afternoon on a problem he could not solve, or he could keep riding toward the one person who could solve the systemic problem that was producing that smoke and every other fire like it across the eastern half of the kingdom. Selene had said years ago in one of those dinner conversations that he had been physically present for and not listening to, that crisis response was always a choice between the immediate visible problem and the invisible structural one. You could spend all your resources on the fire in front of you and go blind to the network of conditions producing the fire. He had not understood what she meant then. He understood it now at a cellular level, riding past smoke, keeping his eyes north. They made the Veth border crossing before dark. The border was not a wall. It was a natural transition. The point where the Ardyn road system gave way to the older northern track, wider spaced settlements, the particular quality of cold that came from elevation rather than latitude. Breck's horse was laboring by the crossing. Cedric's was better, but not much. On the northern side of the crossing, 2 riders were waiting, not Morel's. These were northern-dressed, heavier coats, horses that were mountain-bred and fresh. One of them raised a hand when the group approached, the specific open palm gesture that meant no weapons, not an attack, something else. Cedric slowed. His hand went to his belt anyway. "Lord Heron sends word," the nearer rider said. He had the flat Veth vowels, the accent of the Highlands. Morel's advance riders reached Colrath this morning. The cold in Cedric's chest spread outward. This morning. Before dawn, 5 of them. They presented credentials from General Aveth and demanded access to the Queen's northern administration. And, the rider looked at him steadily, they were told the Queen does not receive visitors before Tuesday. Something moved in Cedric's chest that he did not have a clean word for. "Lord Heron also says," the rider continued, "that the Queen received your letter. She has been aware of your approach since yesterday." A pause. "She said to tell you that you're already late." Cedric processed that. It was not an insult. He knew her well enough now to understand that it wasn't an insult. It was information, delivered in her register, which was precise and without decoration. "You are already late" was the same as saying she had seen the crisis forming before he had been prepared before he arrived, had built the response he was riding toward before he understood he needed one. He had sent 4 sentences. She had been reading the whole situation. "Take us to Colrath," he said. Woots. They rode into the border town of Colrath 2 hours after dark. The town was not the place he had pictured. He had pictured something provincial, something that reflected his default assumption that the north was less than the south. What he found was a settlement that had been a settlement before Ardyn was a kingdom, with the specific confidence of places whose history did not require anyone else's validation. Stone buildings, well-maintained, smoke from every chimney, a main street wide enough for 2 carts, and lit with iron lampposts that someone had recently added because the volume of foot traffic warranted them. The building Heron had established as the Northern Administration Center was a converted merchant hall at the town's center. Lights in every window, 2 armed guards at the door who were not decorative. They let Cedric and Breck through without comment. Inside the main hall, a room that had been built for commercial transactions and had been repurposed into something that ran the political and logistical affairs of a growing alliance. Selene was standing at a table with 3 men Cedric did not recognize, looking at a map. She looked up when he came in. He had not seen her in 4 months. He had known, in an abstract way, that 4 months would change things. He had not calculated specifically what it would change. She looked like a woman who had stopped compensating for something. He couldn't define it more precisely than that. The clothes were different. Northern, practical, wool and leather rather than court fabric. The hair was the same. The stillness of her hands was the same. But something in the way she occupied her own body had shifted. She stood differently. Not harder, not colder. Just more directly herself, the way a person stood when they had stopped spending energy on accommodation. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the wound on Breck's jaw, the blood on 2 of the guard's sleeves, the specific, exhausted urgency of 4 men who had ridden 2 days without proper rest. "Sit down," she said. "To all of them, not just him. Practical. Marin, get food." One of the 3 men at the table moved. Cedric sat. He had rehearsed this. He had spent 2 days on horseback composing what he was going to say when he got here, had built it and rebuilt it into something that said what needed to be said without asking for anything he hadn't earned the right to ask for. What he actually said was, "Morel's riders are already in the region, and I don't know what orders they're running." Selene nodded. "I know. Heron's people have been tracking them since they crossed the border." She turned back to the map. "They're not coordinated enough to be moving on military orders. 5 riders, irregular spacing. They came fast and they came alone, which means they're reconnaissance, not force." "The force comes after," Cedric said. "Yes." She looked at him. "Tell me what happened with Aveth." He told her. All of it. The council session, Varen, the powder in the pantry that he couldn't prove but understood, Cassander's face, the 3 men at the door. He told it without editing, without the instinctive protective omissions he had spent years making in conversations where the full truth was costly. She listened without interrupting. The 3 men at the table listened too, and he let them, because they were her people, and they needed the information, and withholding it in the name of dignity was the kind of calculation he was done making. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The authorization system," she said. "She needs it unlocked. The eastern provinces are at critical. She can't run the distribution without it, and she knows it. So she needs me cooperative or removed." "Yes." Selene looked at the map. Her hand moved to a point north of Kolrath, the mountain pass that connected the Highland territories to the deeper north, where her alliance partners held ground. "She'll send force within a week. She needs it resolved before the eastern province situation becomes unmanageable and the council loses confidence in her." "I know. And the people of Delvath are going to start dying in 6 weeks regardless of what happens between us here." "I know that too." She looked at him then, really looked at him, the way she had always looked at things she needed to understand directly, without the social buffer that most people maintained, the thing that felt almost uncomfortably precise when it was aimed at you. "Why did you come?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. What is the actual reason behind the reasons? He held that question for a moment. "Because Morel is going to hurt people," he said. "People who have nothing to do with what we built and how I broke it. And I am the reason those people are in the path of what's coming. And I don't—" He stopped. "Rebuilt. I don't know how to fix what I broke between us. I don't know if there's a mechanism for that. But I know what's coming south, and I know what it will do when it arrives, and I came to tell you because you needed to know, and because—" He stopped again. "Because," she said. "Because I owed you the truth for a long time, and I kept giving you management instead." The room was quiet. Outside, the wind off the highland moved through the gap between the buildings. One of the lampposts on the main street threw moving light across the hall's windows. Heron appeared in the doorway from the back room. He looked at Cedric with the specific expression of a man who had made his choices and was not renegotiating them, but who was capable of updating his assessment. Then he looked at Selene. "The Southern Outriders are moving," he said. Not Morel's 5. Different group. Aveth's standard advance formation. The room temperature changed. Selene moved before anyone else did. How many? 30 outriders, which means the main force is 2 hours behind. Minimum 200. 200 soldiers against the 300 she had built across 4 months, on terrain that was hers, with people who had chosen to be here. The numbers were not catastrophic. The situation was not unsurvivable. What made it dangerous was the timing. 2 hours meant Aveth had sent the advance formation before Morel had confirmation of what Cedric had told Selene. He had sent it preemptively, which meant either Aveth was operating independently, which was a different and worse problem, or Morel had given the order before Cedric left the palace, which meant she had intended force all along and the council session had been theater. "You knew this was coming," Cedric said. Selene was already moving to the map table. "I knew something was coming. The shape of it, yes." She put her finger on the road south of Colrath. Aveth's advance formations always take the ridge road. It's the defensible high ground, and he's been running the same tactical playbook for 20 years. She looked at Ardyn. "The Veth militia. Ready since yesterday. Position them at the Colrath Ridge before that advance formation gets there. I want the high ground held, not contested." She turned to the 3 men. "Get the allied commanders, now." They moved. She turned to Cedric. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that he had never seen on her face before, which made sense because she had never had reason to produce it before. It was not anger, and it was not forgiveness, and it was not the careful neutrality she had maintained for years. It was the face of a woman who was operating in a situation that required everything she had and had no room for anything that wasn't essential. "Can you fight?" she said. He had not fought since the Northern campaigns 15 years ago. He was 38 years old and had spent 15 years in rooms making decisions instead of writing lines. His body remembered the training the way bodies remembered things that had been beaten into them early and thoroughly, and the 2 days of hard writing had reminded him that he still had the physical architecture even if it was underused. "Yes," he said. She looked at him another second, assessing, not doubting. Then she said, "There are people in this town, traders, families, people who came north because Ardyn failed them, who are going to be in the path of an army in 2 hours. I need them moved to the secondary settlement east of the ridge before Aveth's advance force reaches the road junction." She held his gaze. "Not because you're useful to me militarily, because you know Aveth's protocols and you can talk your way through a checkpoint that would stop any of my people." She was asking him to do the work that needed doing, not the work that looked significant. He understood what she was actually saying, which was, "You're not in command here, but you're not useless, and I'm going to use what you can actually do rather than what you think you should be doing." "All right," he said. Breck beside him straightened. "I know the East Settlement Road." "Then go," Selene said. Cedric stood. He was at the door when she said his name. He turned. She was already looking back at the map, her finger tracing the ridge line, Ardyn beside her, the machinery of something she had built from nothing moving around her with the smooth function of a structure that had been designed well. She said, without looking up, "The 4 sentences. I read them." A pause. "I read them a dozen times." He held the doorway. "Go," she said. "We'll talk when this is done." He went. The next 2 hours were the work. Cedric and Breck moved through Colrath in the specific organized urgency of people who understood that speed and clarity were the same thing right now. He told people what was coming and where to go, and spoke with the flat authority of someone who had stopped performing the role and was just doing it. And the difference was immediately apparent in how people responded to him, not with the careful deference of subjects managing a king, but with the direct cooperation of people who could see that the man in front of them was trying to solve the same problem they were. He moved 43 people to the East Settlement in 90 minutes, a family with 3 children. 2 merchant traders who'd been doing business in the town when everything started moving. An old woman who refused to leave without her card of records, and who turned out to be the Alliance's primary grain accountant, which meant her records were genuinely non-negotiable. He got them all out. He was coming back through the East Road when he heard the ridge. The advance formation had hit the Veth militia positions earlier than projected. The sound of it carried down from the high ground in the specific texture of a fight that had already decided its shape, not the disorganized crash of a surprise engagement, but the structured percussion of two prepared forces fighting each other. He stopped his horse on the road and listened. Breck listened beside him. The ridge fight lasted 22 minutes. Then it went quiet. He did not know, in that quiet, who had held. He did not know if Heron's people were on top of the ridge or if Aveth's 30 outriders were. And until the messenger came down from the high ground, he had no information, and he sat with that not knowing the way he was learning to sit with things he couldn't control, directly, without filling the space with assumption. The messenger came down at a hard gallop, young, northern dressed, pulling up hard in front of Cedric with the specific breathless delivery of someone carrying news they knew mattered. "Ridge is held," the rider said. "Militia held the high ground. Aveth's advance formation pulled back to the main road." Cedric let the air out of his lungs. "The Queen is requesting your presence at the northern command position," the rider continued. "She says the main force has stopped 2 miles south of the ridge." A pause. "She says Aveth wants to parley." Parley. Aveth was a career soldier, 60 years old, who had been fighting wars since before Cedric was born. He knew when a tactical situation had stopped being a tactical situation and started being a political one. 30 outriders sent back from a prepared defensive position meant the main force was looking at numbers and terrain that didn't favor them, and a general who had survived 60 years of service survived it by knowing when to fight and when to talk. Cedric rode to the northern command position. It was a stone building at the ridge's southern approach, one story, functional, with a view of the road below. Selene was at the window when he came in. She turned. "Aveth is asking for the Queen," she said, "not me as an independent political entity, specifically the Queen of Ardyn." He understood what that meant. Aveth was old enough and smart enough to recognize that the legal and political framework he had come north to operate inside was more complicated than Morel had presented it. He was a soldier, not a revolutionary. He had been sent to resolve a situation, and the situation, from the ridge, looked like a war against a legitimate political structure that had not been officially dissolved. He was looking for a way not to do this. "What do you want to do?" Cedric said. Selene looked at him. Then she looked out the window at the road below where 200 soldiers from Ardyn's army sat in the winter dark, waiting. "I want to end this without more blood," she said. "The soldiers down there are Ardyn's soldiers. They followed orders because that's what soldiers do. Aveth gave orders because that's what Aveth does." Her jaw was set. "The people who need to account for what happened in that council chamber are in the palace, not on this road. If you parley with Aveth, I know what it means." He looked at her. She was looking at the road, at the soldiers, at the problem she was going to solve, which was always the problem in front of her, not the problem she wanted it to be. He thought about the woman at the winter banquet who had eaten her dinner with her hands still and her crown on, and absorbed 11 years of diminishment and filed it into the category of things she endured because the kingdom needed her. He thought about the woman who had ridden out of a palace in the dark on a gray horse and not looked back. He thought about what it cost to be that person, and also this person, the one who looked at 200 soldiers on the road below and said, "I don't want more blood." "I'll go with you," he said. She looked at him, the same assessing look. Then something in her face shifted, not softened, but admitted something. The acknowledgement of a person who had been operating alone for a long time and was looking at the specific, complicated reality of not being alone anymore. "Then come," she said. They walked out of the northern command position together. Below the ridge, in the cold dark of the northern road, 200 soldiers from Ardyn watched two figures descend toward the parley line. One wore the Queen's authority like she had never set it down. The other walked beside her carrying nothing except the stripped-down weight of a man who had finally stopped pretending. General Aveth was waiting at the road's edge, mounted, alone. He looked at them both for a long moment. Then he looked past them. Up at the ridge, at the Veth militia positions, he could see an outline against the dark sky. He was doing the count, the same count he had been doing for the last hour. The numbers and the terrain and the question of whether what Morel had sent him north to accomplish was achievable at a cost he was willing to put his name on. He was 60 years old. He had served 4 kings. He had a very precise understanding of what history looked like when you were standing inside it. Your Majesty, he said. He was looking at Selene. He did not look at Cedric. Selene said, General? Aveth looked down at his hands on the reins for a moment. An old man's gesture, the weight of a decision that had already been made, being acknowledged. My orders, he said slowly, were issued under Council Emergency Authority. He paused. Lady Morel's Council Emergency Authority. I know, Selene said. The question I've been sitting with for the last hour, he continued, is whether that authority constitutes a lawful order under the Royal Governance Charter, given that the king is... He glanced at Cedric. Present. Cedric said nothing. Selene said nothing. The road was very quiet. Aveth looked back at the ridge, at the positions he couldn't take without a fight he didn't want to have. At that moment, one of Aveth's outriders came forward at a hard gallop from the southern formation. The rider pulled up beside the general and leaned down and said something, short, urgent, something that arrived in Aveth's face like a stone dropped into still water, the expression going still first and then moving in ways that meant the information was bad and the badness was spreading fast. Aveth looked up. He looked at Selene. His voice, when he spoke, had lost the military deliberateness and become simply the voice of an old soldier who had just heard something that changed the problem. The capital, he said. There's fire in the capital. Selene's hands went still. The Eastern District warehouses, Aveth continued. The riots that were developing, they moved faster than projected. Morel's people tried to shut them down with garrison force, and the garrison... He stopped, chose the word. The garrison's response accelerated the situation. How bad? Cedric said. His voice had gone flat. Aveth looked at him. The grain warehouses are burning, Your Majesty, and the fire is spreading. The road, the ridge, 200 soldiers on one side and 300 on the other, and the capital 60 miles south burning because nobody had unlocked the emergency distribution when it needed to be unlocked. And the people who had been hungry for 6 weeks had found the walls of a warehouse in their own hands and had done what people do when the structures that were supposed to protect them failed completely. Selene's hands. Still. She was looking south, toward a horizon she couldn't see, toward a city she had spent 11 years holding together. Cedric looked at the side of her face and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had run out of versions of the story where he was not responsible, that the fire in the capital was the direct and traceable result of a chain of choices he had made across 11 years and then handed to someone else to finish burning. He could not fix that. He could not reach back through time and unlock the grain stores in October, or unseat the corrupt distribution ministers in the first year, or tell Selene at a dinner table one time that he was listening. What he could do was here, now, on this road, with this woman, with this general who was looking at the two of them and waiting to find out what kind of people they were going to be in the next 60 seconds. Selene turned from the southern horizon. She looked at Aveth. General, she said, how many of your soldiers are from the eastern provinces? Aveth's jaw moved. Most of them. She nodded once. Then they already know what's happening to their families, and so do you. Aveth said nothing. You rode north on a political order, she said. I'm asking you to ride south on a human one. She held his gaze. The capital needs its army, not to suppress riots. To open the warehouses and distribute the grain and stand between the fires and the residential quarters. She paused. That's what soldiers are for. The road held its breath. Aveth looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Cedric. Cedric said, She's right. Aveth looked south. His hand tightened on the reins and released, the gesture of a decision. He turned his horse toward the formation. Form up, he called out. His voice carried down the road with the authority of 30 years. We're riding south. The formation began to move. Selene watched them go. Her hands at her sides, still as they had always been, and in her face something that was not triumph, not relief, was simply the expression of someone watching a terrible situation become slightly less terrible because someone made the right call, and the right call was available because she had built the alternative that made it available. She had done that. From nothing. In 4 months. With no palace and no treasury, and nothing but the work of her hands and the credibility of being a person who did what she said. Cedric stood beside her on the road. Neither of them spoke. Then from behind them, from the ridge, a rider came down fast, one of Heron's, pulling up short, breathing hard, with the specific expression of someone carrying news that had not stopped being terrible on the way down the hill. "My queen," the rider said. "Message from our contact inside the palace. Morel has locked down the royal treasury. All of it. The emergency funds, the crown reserves, the operational accounts." A pause. "And she's issued a warrant." Selene looked at the rider steadily. "For whom?" she said. The rider looked at Cedric, then back at Selene. "For both of you," he said. "Charged with abandonment of crown authority and conspiracy to destabilize the kingdom." Selene was quiet. Cedric felt something in his chest tighten and settle simultaneously, the way a rope went taut before it was tested. "Then we ride south," she said. She turned and walked back up the ridge toward the command position and the horses and the work that was not finished. Not running, not hesitating, walking the way she walked, directly, with her hands still, as if the problem in front of her was simply the next thing after the last thing. And she had been doing that her entire life and had not stopped doing it yet. Cedric stood on the road for one more second. The capital was burning. Morel held the treasury and the warrant and the palace and the official machinery of a crown that had been running on Selene's work for 11 years, and was now about to find out what happened when someone else tried to use the same levers without understanding what the levers were connected to. He thought about the 23 stone faces looking down from the walls of the great hall. All those carved kings jaw-set and cold-eyed watching the living from a permanent elevation. He had spent 15 years trying to be one of them. He ran to catch up with her. They rode south through the night, not an army, not a procession. Selene and Cedric and Breck and 11 northern riders that Heron had insisted on sending. Men who knew the highland roads and carried the quiet competence of people who had chosen to be somewhere rather than been ordered there. Heron himself rode at the column's rear, white-haired and straight-backed on a mountain horse, saying nothing, which was the loudest possible statement about where his loyalties had landed. The capital's glow was visible 30 miles out. Not the warm gold of a city at night. Something hotter and less controlled. Orange at the base, black smoke rising into the clouds above it. The specific color of things that were built over generations being consumed in hours. Cedric rode toward it and kept his eyes on it and did not look away. He had looked away from things for too long. Selene rode beside him in the dark and did not speak. And he understood that the silence was not coldness. It was the silence of someone spending their energy on what was ahead rather than what was behind them. She had always been efficient with herself, even now, especially now. He thought about the journey between the person who had ridden out of this city 4 months ago and the person riding back into it tonight, and he understood that the distance between those two women was not the distance of time, but of choice. She had chosen, in the dark and the cold on a gray horse, to stop enduring and start building. And what she had built in 4 months, without the backing of a throne or a treasury, was more functional and more trusted than what he had presided over for 15 years with both. That was the lesson that sat in his chest like a stone on the road south. Not that she was better than him. That was simple, and he had known it for years while refusing to know it. The harder lesson was about the relationship between what you were given and what you made. He had been given everything. He had made excuses. She had been given the role of consort in a court that diminished her, and she had made a system that kept 300,000 people fed. Power wasn't the chair you sat in. Power was what you did in the room when no one was looking at you. He had spent 15 years performing in front of the audience. She had spent 15 years doing the work. They reached the outer city roads at dawn. The smoke was worse from the ground than it had been from the ridge. The Eastern Grain District had taken the worst of it. 3 warehouses fully gone, 2 more partially, the surrounding structures damaged by heat and ember drift. But Avith had been here for 6 hours by the time they arrived, and the general had understood immediately what needed doing and had done it without waiting for authorization. The soldiers were organized into fire lines. The remaining warehouse stocks were being distributed by hand, right there on the district streets. No bureaucracy, no documentation, just grain moving from storage into the hands of people who needed it. The riots had stopped when the grain started moving. That was the truth of it. Not suppressed. Stopped. Because the riots were never about destruction. They were about the gap between what people needed and what the structures around them were providing. Close the gap, and the violence had nothing to feed on. Selene had known this. She had built the distribution network knowing this. Cedric walked through the Eastern District in the early morning light and looked at what a failed system looked like up close. The burned faces of warehouse walls, the ash in the streets, the people sitting in doorways with the exhausted eyes of those who had been scared for a long time and were only now beginning to believe the immediate danger had passed. He looked at all of it. He did not manage how it landed in him. It landed like what it was. The palace gates were closed. Selene stood in front of them in the gray morning with her northern riders behind her and Cedric beside her, and looked at the iron and stone of the place she had spent 11 years inside. Breck said, "The garrison inside has about 40 men. The rest are with Aveth." "The gate mechanism," Selene said. "Manual from the inside. Needs 3 men at the wheel." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who's on gate duty this morning?" Breck looked at her. "The night rotation. Probably Davin and 2 others from the South Stable unit." She looked at the gate for another moment. Then she walked forward alone and knocked. 3 times, evenly spaced. Silence. Then, from the other side, a voice. Young, recognizable. "Who's there?" Selene said, "Open the gate, Davan." A long pause. The gate opened. Davin stood at the wheel mechanism with 2 other young men who looked like they had been awake all night and were deeply uncertain about every decision they had made in the last 48 hours. He looked at Selene. He looked at Cedric. His jaw was set in exactly the same way it had been set 4 months ago in the dark of a stable when a queen had asked him to say he hadn't seen her. "My queen," he said. "Well done," she said. She meant it fully. They went in. The confrontation with Morel did not happen the way confrontations happened in the stories Cedric had heard growing up. No throne room full of witnesses, no dramatic declaration, no moment staged for an audience. It happened in the council chamber. Morel was there when they arrived, sitting at the table with 2 of Aldrich's men and a stack of documents that represented the administrative infrastructure she had been building for months. She looked up when the door opened. She saw Selene first, then Cedric, then Heron in the doorway behind them. She did not stand. She looked at the situation the way she always looked at situations, calculating, reading the variables, finding the angles. And then something happened that Cedric had never seen in her face before, which was the specific moment when the calculation finished and the result was clear, and there was no version of the next few minutes that ended differently than it was going to end. She set her hands flat on the table. "The treasury is locked," she said. "The authorization codes are on a key I have personally." "I know," Selene said. "You can't run the emergency distribution without the treasury operational." "I ran emergency distribution last night through Aveth's military supply allocation. It'll hold for 72 hours. Selene walked to the table. She did not sit down. She stood at the near end and looked at Morel directly. "What I need from you is the key, the authorization documents, and the names of every person in this palace that Aldrich placed in the last 4 months." Morel's jaw tightened. "And in exchange," she said, "you leave the palace today. You leave the city within the week. Whatever you have in the way of personal property and funds, you take with you." Selene's voice was even. Not generous and not cruel, transactional, which was what the moment required. "I'm not interested in a trial. I'm not interested in a public reckoning. I need the palace functional and the Eastern Province situation stabilized, and I cannot spend the next 6 months doing both of those things and managing a proceeding against you simultaneously." Morel looked at her for a long time. "That's it," she said. "That's it. You're not going to, no." Selene met her gaze. "You are a capable and dangerous person who made choices. I am not going to pretend the choices weren't made, but I am also not going to spend the kingdom's resources punishing you when those resources are needed for people who are hungry." Something moved across Morel's face. It was not gratitude. It was something harder and more honest than gratitude. The specific expression of a person who had expected to be treated as an enemy and was instead being treated as a problem that had been solved. It was, Cedric thought, the most destabilizing thing Selene could have done to her. Morel reached into her coat and set a key on the table. Then she stood up and walked to the door. She stopped when she reached Cedric. She looked at him for a moment. The amber eyes with all their calculation, all the intelligence she had never had to hide from him, all the things they had both been to each other and the wreckage of what that had cost. She said, "You were better than you let yourself be." Then she walked out. Pasit. The days that followed were not clean. Clean endings existed in stories where the people involved had been simple. Ardyn was not simple, and neither were its people, and the work of putting the palace back in functional order after months of Morel's reorganization was the kind of detailed institutional labor that could not be rushed or dramatized. Selene did it with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything, working 18-hour days rebuilding the administrative structures that had been fragmented, reinstating the coordinators who had been pushed aside, reopening the authorization channels that had been locked. Cedric worked beside her, not in charge, not directing, working. He learned what he had not let himself learn in 15 years of being handed competent briefings, the actual mechanics of what running a kingdom required at the operational level. The grain accounting, the levy management, the correspondence chains that maintained the foreign relationships Selene had spent years cultivating. He was slow at it. He made mistakes. On the third day, he misread a distribution allocation and redirected a shipment that then had to be rerouted at significant cost, and he stood in the accounting room with the error in front of him and did not explain it or minimize it. He wrote the correction order himself, noted the error in the record with his own name attached, and kept working. Selene, who had been at the other end of the table, said nothing, but he felt her attention shift toward him and then away, and understood that the shift meant something. On the fifth day, Lord Cassander came to him. He came alone, which was either courage or calculation, and his face had the look of a man who had spent 5 days deciding what kind of person he was going to be for the rest of his life. He stood in the doorway of the study where Cedric was working and said, "I'd like to explain." Cedric looked at him. "You don't need to," he said. "I know what happened. I know why." "Your Majesty." "I made it easy," Cedric said. "I made it easy to calculate that she was the safer bet. That's on me." He held Cassander's gaze. "If you want to keep your position, talk to the Queen. It's her decision. I'm not in the business of running the council anymore." Cassander blinked. "I don't understand." "I know." Cedric turned back to the papers in front of him. "That's something you're going to have to sit with." Cassander stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he went to find Selene. On the 9th day, the Royal Council met in full session. All 7 seats occupied for the first time in months. Selene at the table's head. Cedric to her left, in the seat that had been the consort seat for 200 years. She called the session to order and immediately introduced a proposal that no one in the room had been prepared for. She proposed the dissolution of the absolute crown authority structure and its replacement with a council-administered governance charter in which the crown held ceremonial and arbitrative functions, but executive authority resided with an elected council of ministers. She laid out the argument in 17 minutes. It was the most efficient 17 minutes of political reasoning Cedric had ever heard in that room. Specific, evidence-based, preempting the obvious counterarguments before they could be raised, acknowledging the genuine complications without letting them obscure the core logic. The council sat with it. Then Heron, from his seat at the table's far end, said, "I second the proposal." The vote was 5-2, Archimes. 3 weeks later, Cedric called for Selene. She came to the study in the late afternoon, the same study they had both been working in for 3 weeks, the room that smelled of paper and old wood and the particular cold that came through the north window, no matter what the season. She sat down across the table from him. He had been thinking about what to say for 3 days and had decided that thinking about what to say was the wrong approach, that the calculated management of his words was exactly the thing that had cost him the most over the longest time. He said, "I'm going to leave the palace." She was still. "Not because I'm being asked to, because it's the right thing." He held her gaze. "The governance charter passes better without the question of my role in it hanging over every decision, and I have—" He stopped, rebuilt the sentence into something truer. "I have a specific thing I need to do. The villages in the eastern provinces, the ones that took the worst of the grain crisis, I want to go there and work. Work, she said. Build, repair, whatever they need that I can do with my hands. He paused. I spent 15 years making decisions that affected people I never stood close enough to see. I want to try it the other way. Selene looked at him for a long moment. He had gotten better in the last 3 weeks at letting her look, at not filling her silences with explanation or defense, at trusting that her process was her process and it would reach its conclusion without his interference. You'll be terrible at it, she said. Yes. You'll be slow and you'll make mistakes, and the people there have no particular reason to trust you. Yes. And you think that's still worth doing. He thought about the smoke visible from a northern road, about a grain accountant and her cart of records, about a 16-year-old in a stable with his jaw set against the dark. Yes, he said. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, the Eastern Province allocation, the Delvath Secondary Distribution Network. There's a coordinator position there that hasn't been filled since the restructuring. It pays nothing and requires someone who understands both the administrative framework and the physical logistics of rural distribution. He looked at her. It would take you approximately 6 months to learn it adequately, she said. A year to do it well. Are you offering me a job? I'm telling you a position exists. She held his gaze. What you do with that information is your decision. He was quiet for a moment. Selene, he said. She waited. I don't have a version of an apology that's adequate for what I did, he said. I've been looking for one for 3 weeks and I don't think it exists, so I'm going to tell you something instead. He held her gaze the way she had always held things, directly, without flinching from the cost of the contact. What you built, here and in Colrath, and in every system in this palace that kept people alive while I was looking the other way, I saw it. I see it. I know what it was worth, and I know what it cost you, and I know that I am the reason it cost you that much. He paused. I can't give that back, but I can stop pretending I don't know it. The study was quiet. Outside the north window, the city of Ardyn was going about its ordinary life. The sounds of a settlement that had come through a fire and was rebuilding, which sounded exactly like a settlement that had not been through a fire, except with a slightly higher proportion of hammering. Selene looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked up. You asked me, on the northern road, what I had been doing for 4 months, she said. I didn't fully answer. You said building. I was also deciding. She held his gaze. What I was willing to carry forward and what I wasn't. A pause. I'm not willing to carry the version of this where I spend the rest of my life being the woman who was wronged. Not because it isn't true, because it's too small. She looked at him with the precision that had always been the thing about her. The quality of attention that saw clearly and did not dress what it saw in comfortable clothing. You were a coward for a long time, and you stopped. That's not nothing. It's not everything. But it's not nothing. Cedric held that. It was not forgiveness in the way the word was usually used, the dramatic restoration, the return to what had been. What she was offering was harder and more honest than that. She was offering him a true accounting, the recognition that a person's full record included what they had been and what they chose to become, and that both parts were real, and that the second part had weight. He had not known, until this moment, that that was what he needed. Not absolution, accuracy. He nodded once. She nodded once. Outside, the hammering continued. The inauguration of the governance charter took place on a Tuesday in early spring. The Great Hall of Ardyn was full. The full court, the foreign dignitaries, the council in formal dress, and at the back of the hall, in a section that had not been traditionally reserved for them, several hundred ordinary residents of the city who had been invited specifically because Selene had rewritten the invitation protocols to include them. The 23 stone kings looked down from the columns. Selene walked into the room alone. She wore the northern style, structured wool, no excess ornamentation, the crown sitting at the base of her dark hair the way it had always sat, like something she had chosen rather than something imposed. She walked to the front of the room and turned and faced the full court of Ardyn in the silence of 1,000 people who had gathered to see what she was going to do. She read the charter aloud. All of it. Every clause. Not because it was required, but because she wanted every person in the room to hear the specific language of what they were agreeing to. The mechanisms, the limitations, the structural protections that were built into the document to prevent any single person, including her, from accumulating the kind of unchecked authority that had produced everything the last year had cost them. It took 41 minutes. When she finished, the council signed, then the foreign witnesses. Then the document was sealed and the charter of Ardyn's new governance structure was complete and real and in effect. The hall held its breath for one more moment. Then Heron, from his seat, began to applaud. Not the polished court applause of people performing approval. The real kind. The kind that came from the hands of a man who meant it. The room followed. Selene stood at the front of the great hall while the sound moved through it and looked out at the faces of a kingdom she had decided to try to save. Not because it owed her that, or because the people in it had all behaved well, but because the people in the eastern districts who were waiting for grain distribution, and the people in the back of this room who had never been invited before, and the 16-year-old in the stable who had set his jaw against the dark, were all, in some way, what the work was for. She had not started this year by choosing to save a kingdom. She had started it by choosing herself. And it turned out that those two things, done in the right order, produced something that neither choice could have produced alone. Cedric left the capital on a Wednesday morning. Plain clothes, one horse, a letter of introduction from the Eastern Distribution Office that described him as a coordinator's assistant with administrative experience and no particular status. He had requested that Selene not come to see him off, because goodbyes of that kind asked for something from her that he had not earned the right to ask for. She did not come. He was a mile out of the city when he found Devon at the road junction. The young man on a plain horse, a travel pack strapped behind his saddle, jaw set in that same expression. Cedric stopped. "What are you doing?" he said. "Going east," Devon said. "My family's from Delvath. I know the distribution roads." A pause. "And someone who knows them should probably go with you." Cedric looked at him for a moment. He thought about the particular stubbornness of people who decided, quietly, without announcement, that they would not participate in things that were wrong. How that quality showed up in a 16-year-old in a stable and a 61-year-old duke, and a woman riding a gray horse into a dark winter road, and how it was always the same quality. Not heroism, not nobility in the elevated sense, just the flat refusal of a person who had looked at the available choices and decided that the comfortable wrong one was not acceptable. He had spent 15 years not being that person. He was learning. "Then ride," he said. They rode east. 3 years later, a traveler passing through the Delvath secondary district would find a distribution network running at full functional capacity for the first time in its history, coordinated by a quiet man who knew the administrative framework from the inside and spent most of his time on the physical roads between villages, and who was known in the district simply by his given name without a title, which was how he had introduced himself and how he preferred to be addressed. The people of the district did not know his history, or those who suspected it kept it to themselves, because he worked hard and made mistakes and learned from them, and came back the next day and kept working, which was all they had ever needed from any of them. The kingdom of Ardyn, under its new charter, was not a perfect place. It was better than it had been. The woman who had built the charter worked long days and slept well at night and received visitors on Tuesdays. And the council she had structured ran its own arguments and reached its own conclusions and pushed back on her when she was wrong, which she had specifically designed it to do because she understood, from hard personal experience, that the most dangerous thing a structure could do was make one person's judgment the last word. She had her own rooms in the north wing now. She had her gray horse. She had her hands, still at her sides, and the particular quality of attention she brought to the world, and the knowledge that she had looked at the worst of what a person could do to another person and had decided with eyes open what to do with it. Not forgotten, not erased, converted into charter language and distribution networks, and a governance structure that would outlast every person in the room on the day it was signed. That was what strength looked like when it was done being performed. Not the crown, not the hall, not the stone faces of the dead kings looking down at the living, the grain reaching the people who needed it, the doors opening, the ordinary morning continuing. Years after, when travelers and scholars asked what had broken Ardyn and what had rebuilt it, the answers they got from people who had lived through it were always simpler than the question expected. What had broken it was a man who had everything and spent it on nothing, who mistook the stillness around him for the absence of work rather than the presence of someone doing the work so quietly he never heard it. What had rebuilt it was a woman who had been made invisible and chose, one night, to stop waiting to be seen. The crown was still in the palace, in a glass case in the East Hall. Selene had put it there herself, on the day the charter was signed. Not as a statement, not as theater. Simply because it was an object that had served its purpose, and objects that had served their purpose should be put somewhere where they could be seen for what they had been, which was useful, and what they were now, which was history. The palace still stood. The Great Hall was used for council sessions and public hearings, and on certain spring evenings for gatherings that included the people from the back of the room. The 23 stone kings looked down from their columns at a room that no longer needed them to define it. The candles still burned. The kingdom held,